What's up, everyone? Thank you for watching. I'm Justin Burkholz. This week, my video is going to be all about prayer. So, what it is, how to do it, why to do it. If you've ever had any questions about prayer, hopefully those will be answered by the end of this video. So, stick around. Before we get to the good stuff, if you want to support my effort to bring open-minded, scholarly perspectives to often misunderstood topics and complex spiritual concepts, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the like button and leave me a comment if you learned anything or enjoyed the video. All of that really helps me out. All right, thank you. Now let's get back to the video. I had a powerful spiritual experience, what some would call a mystical experience, back in 2017, and that was when my fascination with prayer began. Before then, it was not something that really interested me at all. See, I was raised in a Protestant Christian environment, and prayer was something I was very used to from a young age. However, I always had a lot of anxiety about speaking in front of other people, even if it was just a small group like my own family. Because of this and my general uneasiness with Christianity at the time, I had a very different relationship with prayer as a youth and a teen. It was something I didn't really understand and dreaded having to do. Then as a young adult, I felt dissatisfied with the religion I grew up with and turned away from religion and spirituality and towards a more scientific and materialist worldview, as many young people do. And for most of my 20s, I had no interest in prayer or spiritual practices or religion at all. But after that transformative experience in 2017, that changed completely. But at that time, I had no framework to understand what had happened or what to do next. I had no wisdom tradition to guide me and didn't know anyone who had a similar experience. So I went to a nearby used bookstore and went to the spirituality and philosophy sections, somewhere I had never browsed before, and just looked around to see what I might find. And I left with some really amazing gems, including The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, and a beautiful little book called The Illuminated Prayer by Coleman Barks and Michael Green. This book introduced me to a whole new form and philosophy of prayer that I found beautiful and inspiring. I also began reading everything I could about all of the mystics, saints, and sages mentioned in the Perennial Philosophy, and studying their writings and their prayers. According to Huxley, the word prayer is applied to at least 4 distinct procedures: petition, intercession, adoration, and contemplation. Petition is asking of something for ourselves. Intercession is asking of something for other people. Adoration is the use of the intellect, feeling, will, and imagination in making acts of devotion directed toward God in his personal aspect or as incarnated in human form, such as Jesus. Contemplation is that condition of alert passivity in which the soul lays itself open to the divine ground within and without, the immanent and transcendent Godhead. And that's from Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, chapter 16, on prayer. And we will return to each of those procedures and talk about them in more detail. So at this time in my life, I wanted to write my own prayer, one which would be a powerful practice for many years to come, and which would be my daily reminder of what is sacred to me and what I truly believe and desire. I wanted to be very intentional about the crafting of this prayer, because I had begun to see prayer as a powerful tool, a psychotechnology to reshape the self. That's why I looked to the saints and mystics for inspiration to help me craft my prayer. I aspired to be like them. This is prayer as attunement, as a way to tune or shape the self. And we could call that a form of adoration. A much more common form of prayer is what's known as petitionary prayer. But petitionary prayer can also function as attunement. St. Francis of Assisi, one of the saints whom I revere the most, would often petition God for guidance on how to live according to your holy will and to follow your true commandments. We also can petition God to help us become more virtuous. William Law understood the power of prayer to shape behavior, prayer as attunement, and wrote much about it, specifically the type of prayer called intercession. In perhaps his most succinct statement on the matter, he states, "For you cannot possibly despise and ridicule that man whom your private prayers recommend to the love and favor of God." I've also found this to be true personally. If I'm having negative thoughts about someone, I try to include them in my prayers and moments of gratitude. And this really does work to quickly change the way I feel about them. The philosopher Iris Murdoch also understood this aspect of prayer when she stated, "One of the main problems with moral philosophy might be formulated thus. Are there any techniques for the purification and reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish, in such a way that when moments of choice arrive, we shall be sure of acting rightly?" The technique which Plato thought appropriate to this situation I shall discuss later. Much closer and more familiar to us are the techniques of religion, of which the most widely practiced is prayer. What becomes of such a technique in a world without God? And can it be transformed to supply at least part of the answer to our central question? Prayer is not properly petition, but simply an attention to God, which is a form of love. With it goes the idea of grace, of a supernatural assistance to human endeavor, which overcomes empirical limitations of personality. What is this attention like? And can those who are not religious still conceive of profiting by such an activity? That's from her book, The Sovereignty of Good. We'll discuss what that attention is like throughout this video, and her conclusion, as well as my own, is yes, those who are not religious believers can still profit from the activity of prayer. And we'll talk about why. But this is prayer as attunement, which brings us to the first arcanum of prayer. Prayer imbues meaning. We will care about what we pray about. Okay, so my daily prayer was the first spiritual practice I ever created and shared. I ended up calling it the Prophet's Prayer, based both on those who influenced its creation and its intended effect, to attune those who recite it to the consciousness of the great prophets. I'm going to read that prayer for you really quickly, just so you can get an example of what exactly I'm talking about, and what I ended up with after I went through the long process of crafting a very intentional prayer. So this is my own, what I call the Prophet's Prayer. Almighty God, beautiful Redeemer, blessed Savior, boundlessly compassionate, boundlessly merciful. You are love absolute, peace absolute, and bliss absolute. You are the creator of all things and the perfect unity. Yours is the pure light, source of all others. All righteous and virtuous things that may seem to come from me do not. It is purely your light shining through me. I cannot take the credit or claim ownership. You are the Father of all lights and the sole source. All of the good that comes from this body and mind are not my own. I am merely a caretaker. My job is to maintain and keep clean the mirror of my soul, so that you may continue to shine through me as brightly as possible. My hope and prayer is that by shining your light into the darkness, others who are lost may be found. That by catching a glimpse of light, they may find their way out of darkness into the pure light and glory of your presence. I must do my best to show them how to do their job as caretaker, so that the light of God may shine brightly through them as well. I pray that all of mankind will come to know you in this fashion. May everyone come to know your love and your peace that transcend all circumstances, and come to live in your eternal presence. Amen. If you're interested, you can learn more about my daily prayer and how to create your own in my book, Foundations. That prayer has served me so well for many years and has been picked up and used by spiritual seekers all around the world. But I want to return to those who inspired me and what they have to say about prayer, starting with the other great mystic I've written about and created videos about, Francois Fenelon. If you're interested in learning more about Fenelon, check out my video all about him, his life, and teachings. But according to him, to pray is to desire. So let's dig into what he means by that. Here's a quote from Francois Fenelon. True prayer is only another word for the love of God. Its excellence does not consist in the multitude of our words, for our Father knoweth what things we have need of before we ask him. True prayer is that of the heart, and the heart prays only for what it desires. To pray, then, is to desire, but to desire what God would have us desire. He who asks for what he does not from the bottom of his heart desire is mistaken in thinking that he prays. Let him spend days in reciting prayers, in meditation, or in inciting himself to pious exercises. He prays not once truly, if he really desires not the things he pretends to ask. Oh, how few there are who pray, for how few are they who desire what is truly good. Crosses, external and internal humiliation, renouncement of our own wills, and the death of self, and the establishment of God's throne upon the ruins of self-love. These are indeed good. Not to desire these is not to pray. To desire them seriously, soberly, constantly, and with reference to all the details of life, this is true prayer. Not to desire them, and yet to suppose that we pray is an illusion like that of the wretched who dream themselves happy. Alas, how many souls full of self and of an imaginary desire for perfection in the midst of hosts of voluntary imperfections have never yet uttered this true prayer of the heart. It is in reference to this that St. Augustine says, "He that loveth little prayeth little. He that loveth much prayeth much." On the other hand, that heart in which the true love of God and true desire exist never ceases to pray. That is from his book, Christian Counsel on Diverse Matters Pertaining to the Inner Life, Chapter 4 on Prayer and the Principal Exercises of Piety. You see, for Fenelon, the inner life was of the utmost importance. To him, our intentions and the desires of our hearts are what truly matter. He reminds us that prayer doesn't have to be spoken or even thought. True prayer comes from the heart. It is inspired by love and desire. It is love and desire. This is both shocking and in some ways obvious. If God, Source, the One, is omniscient, then it makes perfect sense that he knoweth what things we have need of before we ask him. But the consequences of that are profound. And this is the second arcanum of prayer. True prayer is to desire what God would have us desire. And we constantly pray for that which we desire. If you remember the first arcanum and then apply the second, you can see that a reinforcing loop can be created within. By one form of prayer, you can shape what you desire in your heart to be that which God would have us desire. then the deep prayer of the heart kicks in and constantly prays for that which you desire. This in turn deepens the desire, and on it goes. For the next arcanum of prayer, we're going to turn back to my dear friend Aldous Huxley and what he had to say about those various procedures in his book, The Perennial Philosophy. There he says, petitionary and intercessory prayer may be used, and what is more, with what would ordinarily be regarded as success, without any but the most perfunctory and superficial reference to God in any of his aspects. To acquire the knack of getting his petitions answered, a man does not have to know or love God, or even to know or love the image of God in his own mind. All that he requires is a burning sense of the importance of his own ego and its desires, coupled with a firm conviction that there exists, out there in the universe, something not himself which can be wheedled or dragooned into satisfying those desires. Meanwhile, we shall be well advised to heed the warnings of folklore. Those anonymous realists who wrote the world's fairy stories knew a great deal about wishes and their fulfillment. They knew, first of all, that in certain circumstances petitions actually get themselves answered. But they also knew that God is not the only answerer, and that if one asks for something in the wrong spirit, it may in effect be given, but given with a vengeance, and not by a divine giver. Hardly ever do the three wishes of our traditional fairy lore lead to anything but a bad end for the successful wisher. Once again, that is from The Perennial Philosophy, chapter 16 on prayer. See, prayer is powerful, whether it's the prayer of the ego or the prayer of the heart, and it's likely to be answered, but it might not be the answer you want. Or you may get what you wanted, but it comes with dire consequences. Much of that will depend on whether you've realized and put into practice the first two arcanums. You will receive what is spiritually, morally, and sometimes even materially good for you to the extent that your will coincides with the will of God. In other words, to the extent that you desire what God would have you desire. Picture God as saying to you, "My son, why is it that day by day you rise and pray and genuflect and even strike the ground with your forehead, nay, sometimes even shed tears? While you say to me, 'My Father, my God, give me wealth.' If I were to give it to you, you would think yourself of some importance, and you would fancy you had gained something very great. But before you had it, you were humble. Now that you have begun to be rich, you despise the poor. What kind of good is that which only makes you worse? Ask of me better things than these, greater things than these. Ask of me spiritual things. Ask of me myself." It's a quote from St. Augustine. As you can see, there are some potential dangers to prayer, which leads us to the third arcanum of prayer: be careful what you pray for. Prayer can also be taken much further than we've discussed so far. It is actually considered the ultimate spiritual practice, the path to communion with God. Now, this usually involves a crossover between the different procedures of prayer that Huxley delineated. The fourth procedure, contemplation, is actually a name for non-dual mystical experience. In other words, union or communion with God. Remember how we defined contemplation. Contemplation is that condition of alert passivity in which the soul lays itself open to the divine ground within and without, the immanent and transcendent Godhead. He explains further in the next paragraph. Psychologically, it is all but impossible for a human being to practice contemplation without preparing for it by some form of adoration, and without feeling the need to revert at more or less frequent intervals to intercession and some form of at least petition. On the other hand, it is both possible and easy to practice petition apart not only from contemplation, but also from adoration, and in rare cases of extreme and unmitigated egotism, even from intercession. Now, I tried to highlight or emphasize each time he referred to a procedure of prayer in that paragraph. If you noticed, he referred to all of them, and he talked about how, depending on the person and their level of egotism, they may make use of all forms. And you can see that he talks about some kind of crossover between the procedures. He states very plainly that adoration is practically a necessary prerequisite for contemplation, with intercession and petition also very likely being made use of to reach that state. I want to highlight this because I think it is really important not to demonize or neglect any of the different forms or procedures of prayer. I see that a lot, where people demonize a specific type of prayer, usually out of some kind of ignorance or misconception. They are all important. They form a cohesive ecology. And as Huxley warned us, practicing petition apart from the rest can actually be dangerous. Remember the third arcanum. But let's return to prayer as the path to communion with another perspective on prayer from a 17th century Benedictine mystic, Father Augustine Baker. Now, prayer, in its general notion, may be defined to be an elevation of the mind to God, or, more largely and expressly thus, prayer is an actuation of an intellective soul towards God, expressing or at least implying an entire dependence on Him as the author and fountain of all good, a will and readiness to give Him His due, which is no less than all love, all obedience, adoration, glory, and worship, by humbling and annihilating the self and all creatures in His presence, and lastly, a desire and intention to aspire to an union of spirit with Him. Here we see that he too says that adoration is what can lead us to contemplation, which he speaks of in terms that sound very much like a mystical experience. In another passage he writes, "The soul elevates her will towards God, apprehended by the understanding as a spirit, and not as an imaginary thing. The human spirit in this way aspiring to a union with the divine spirit." But while his language is more conservative and talks of aspiring to union, Huxley had no such reservations and states very plainly, adoration is an activity of the loving but still separate individuality. Contemplation is the state of union with the divine ground of all being. This is the fourth arcanum of prayer. Adoration is the path to contemplation. But this leaves us with something of a conundrum, because adoration powerful enough to lead to a mystical experience or state of contemplation is not something that can be faked. And it's not something that abstractions are capable of inspiring. We can't love an abstraction. It has to be spirit to spirit. For some guidance on how to cultivate that state of adoration, I want to turn back to my friend Francois Fenelon, the Archbishop and tutor to kings, who was considered one of the greatest educators of his time, and he has much to say on the subject. And I quote, "There are two principal points of attention necessary for the preservation of this constant spirit of prayer that unites us to God. We must continually seek to cherish it, and we must avoid everything that tends to make us lose it. In order to cherish it, we should pursue a regulated course of reading. We must have appointed seasons of secret prayer and frequent states of recollection during the day. We should make use of retirement when we feel the need of it, or when it is advised by those of greater experience, and unite in the ordinances appropriate to our condition. We should greatly fear and be exceedingly cautious to avoid all things that have a tendency to make us lose the state of prayer. Once again, that is from Christian Counsel on Diverse Matters Pertaining to the Inner Life, Chapter 4, on prayer and the principal exercises of piety. As usual, Fenelon gives us some really good advice here. Firstly, to read. Read. And he gives further instructions on what to read. He says we should read books that, and I quote, instruct us in our duty and in our faults, which, while they point out the greatness of God, teach us what is our duty to him and how very far we are from performing it, not those barren productions which melt and sentimentalize the heart. So he says that we should read books which promote humility and love of God. And secondly, he says that we should have regularly appointed times for secret prayer, which is just alone time with God. And that these, quote, seasons of secret prayer must be regulated by the leisure, disposition, condition, and the inward impulse of each individual. Because everyone desires and needs different amounts of prayer and meditation, depending on their personality, natural temperament, and inward impulse. Don't push yourself to try and do more than what feels right for you. In the very next line, he reveals our next arcanum. Quoting again, meditation is not prayer, but it is its necessary foundation. It brings to mind the truths which God has revealed. We should be conversant not only with all the mysteries of Jesus Christ and the truths of his gospel, but also with everything they ought to operate in us for our regeneration. We should be colored and penetrated by them as the wool is by the dye. Here he tells us the secret of how to know what to pray for and how to incorporate our reading into our inner life through prayer and meditation so that we are colored or transformed by it. This is the fifth arcanum of prayer. Meditation is the foundation of prayer. It is through meditation that we gain the awareness and clarity we need to know where our opportunities for growth are, and therefore what we should pray for. Now, according to Fenelon, our prayer begins to be real and fruitful. All right, I know we've already kind of covered a lot, and you may need to rewatch this to catch everything. That's okay. This is complex, and prayer is such an interesting topic. I wanted to bring a lot of different perspectives to it. There's one more arcanum here that I want to cover in this video, and then I'll talk a little bit about how to choose or write your own prayer, and we'll wrap it up. All right, so the very last arcanum, invoke often, inflame yourself with prayer. These are the instructions passed down to seekers throughout the ages, from the Chaldean oracles to the book of sacred magic of Abramelin the mage, through Israel Regardie to me, and now through me to you. Regardie, one of the most important figures of 20th century Western esotericism, and the man responsible for conserving and passing on the profound knowledge of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and bringing a valid branch of their initiatory lineage to the United States, ends his book, The 1-Year Manual, with a chapter of this name: Invoke often, inflame yourself with prayer. This book guides the reader through an intentional series of spiritual exercises that includes some rather elaborate rituals, After all of that, even the prior chapter titled Unity, All is God, he ends his course of instruction with the ultimate spiritual practice, prayer, which might be surprising to some of you. It certainly was for me. But the reality is that prayer is so vital to our spirituality that it is at once the most basic and the most profound of spiritual practices. According to William James, petitional prayer is only one department of prayer. And if we take the word in its wider sense as meaning every kind of inward communion or conversation with the power we recognize as divine, we can easily see that scientific criticism leaves it untouched. Prayer in this wide sense is the very soul and essence of religion. From his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And Auguste Sabatier, the 19th century French Protestant theologian, agrees. He states, "Religion is an intercourse, a conscious and voluntary relation, entered into by a soul in distress with the mysterious power upon which it feels itself to depend, and upon which its fate is contingent. This intercourse with God is realized by prayer. Prayer is religion in act. That is, prayer is real religion. It is prayer that distinguishes the religious phenomenon from such similar or neighboring phenomenon as purely moral or aesthetic sentiment. Religion is nothing if it be not the vital act by which the entire mind seeks to save itself by clinging to the principle from which it draws its life. This act is prayer, by which term I understand no vain exercise of words, no mere repetition of certain sacred formulae, but the very movement itself of the soul, putting itself in a personal relation of contact with the mysterious power of which it feels the presence. It may be even before it has a name by which to call it. Wherever this interior prayer is lacking, there is no religion. Wherever, on the other hand, this prayer rises and stirs the soul, even in the absence of forms or of doctrines, we have living religion." From his Outline of a Philosophy of Religion. If the spiritual life consists in an effort towards ever greater intimacy with the divine or sacred, then we can see how prayer, as the very movement itself of the soul towards the divine, can be at once the most basic and the ultimate spiritual practice. Here we see how prayer can lead toward communion or union with the divine as well. And Regardie reminds us there are higher goals to aspire towards, and through the exaltation of prayer and invocation, you may, God willing, reach those goals, unitive and mystical. And prayer, specifically adoration, is the path. There is one last aspect and technique of prayer that we need to cover, and one final arcanum. It should be apparent by now that invoking, in other words praying, often has many benefits from the ethical to the creative to the spiritual. But what does it mean to inflame yourself with prayer? This refers to the realm of emotion and the building of emotional energy. There are essentially two different directions of spiritual practices. There are calming, quieting, and stilling practices, which turn inward and down to the ground of being. This is instancy. And there are exciting, inflaming, overwhelming practices that turn outward and up to Source or God. This is ecstasy. And prayer can be both. But even more strange is the fact that both paths can lead to the same realizations. As the anonymous author of the great tome of esoteric wisdom, Meditations on the Tarot, states, quote, "Ecstasy to the heights beyond oneself and instancy into the depths within oneself lead to knowledge of the same fundamental truth." Christian esotericism unites these two methods of initiation. The master has two groups of disciples, disciples of the day and disciples of the night. The first being disciples of the way of instancy, and the latter those of the way of ecstasy. He has also a third group of disciples of day and night, i.e., who possess the keys to both doors at once, to the door of ecstasy and that of instancy. From Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 6, The Lover. Both methods, ecstasy and instancy, are valuable, and as we can see, can be sufficient for a spiritual path on their own. I share techniques for both methods here on my channel and on my blog and in my books. But for this video, we are focusing on what I would call ecstatic prayer. This is what it means to inflame thyself with prayer. Most people associate ecstasy with substances or maybe music or dancing. I have an ecstatic singing practice myself, so it may seem strange to talk about ecstatic prayer. But by this point, we've already heard many people attest to its reality, and prayer may actually be the most powerful and effective form of ecstatic practice, and I'll tell you why. There are many techniques of ecstasy. Human beings have been discovering and perfecting them for as long as we can tell. Some scholars actually believe that this is the very origin of all religion and spirituality. But the reason that I believe prayer is the most powerful is because of its specific orientation, the mood or set in which it is performed. This is because ecstasy is simply the experience of being lifted, quote, to the heights beyond oneself. But there are many different heights to which one can be lifted. This is a form of self-transcendence, but there are many levels to which you can transcend. This was perhaps most beautifully articulated by the rabbi and mystic Abraham Isaac Kook, who stated, "There is one who sings the song of his people, emerging from the private circle of his soul, not expansive enough, yet not tranquil. He strives for fierce heights, clinging to the entire community of Israel in tender love. Together with her, he sings her song, feels her anguish, delights in her hopes. He conceives profound insights into her past and her future, deftly probing the inwardness of her spirit with the wisdom of love. Then there is one whose soul expands until it extends beyond the border of Israel, singing the song of humanity. In the glory of the entire human race, in the glory of the human form, his spirit spreads, aspiring to the goal of humankind, envisioning its consummation. From this spring of life he draws all his deepest reflections, his searching, striving, and vision. Then there is one who expands even further until he unites with all of existence, with all creatures, with all worlds, singing a song with them all. There is one who ascends with all these songs in unison, the song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity, the song of the cosmos, resounding together, blending in harmony, circulating the sap of life, the sound of holy joy." Because of prayer's specific orientation as the movement of the soul towards divinity, the level of transcendence to which it brings us in moments of ecstasy is the ultimate level. We become the one who ascends with all these songs in unison when we lift our hearts in prayer to God. We include and transcend the lower levels of the soul, the family, the tribe, the species, and the cosmos. This is the power and promise of prayer. But we must be careful to always remember that communion with divinity is always dependent upon grace. We lift ourselves up and open our hearts and souls to the vine, but it is grace that comes from divinity to illuminate us. Luckily for us, we are like the prodigal son from the biblical parable, and God, the loving Father, who is waiting to run to us and embrace us as soon as we turn towards Him. As Israel Regardie reminds us, for every step we make in His direction, He will take two towards us. Now it's time to get to the practical technique of inflaming oneself with prayer. And here we return to Regardie's Manual of Spiritual Practice and a beautiful summary of everything we've covered so far. Once again, I'm quoting, "Prayer does have the effect of stimulating the mind to function in an entirely new way. It creates, when successful, a revolution of the psychological apparatus, a turning around of the mind. It becomes ecstatically uplifted so as to function in a new way, to perceive new and more spiritual ideas, and experience a hitherto never before experienced life of divinity and high consciousness. The entire object of prayer is to exalt the mind to an indissoluble unity with God. It must lift the mind on wings of ardent aspiration. Thus the phrase, 'inflame thyself with prayer,' in an unrestrained flight of love to a sense of kinship and unity with the whole of life." There must be this ardor. An attitude of cold objectivity and lack of feeling during prayer is, so far as my understanding goes, quite impossible. I cannot conceive how the student who has pondered over a classical invocation and understood it to the extent of employing it as his personal means of exaltation can refrain from being strongly moved emotionally. A prayer, to be successful, should have the effect of bringing about an inner crisis. More often than not, as the student proceeds, he will be bathed in a deluge of tears. Tears not of sorrow, nor even tears of joy, but tears which are the sign and symbol of submission to and union with the source of all life. An ecstasy may result, a thoroughgoing standing out of the mind itself and all concerns with the body and its problems, from neurosis and inner turmoils. It should raise the individual above all temporal and personal matters so as to realize that the heresy of separation is ended for all time. He and God are one. The whole secret of prayer lies in this direction. Invoke often, inflame thyself with prayer. It aims at moving the individual in ecstasy to transcend himself. In short, prayer consists of a complex of psychological and spiritual gestures, all of which should prove relatively easy after the prolonged discipline engaged in for the past several months or more, in his book, designed to enable us to recover our true identity, which is God. The technique of ecstatic prayer, then, is the building up of emotional energy through spiritual gestures, such as the recitation of words, postures, and hand gestures, lighting of candles or incense, etc., to bring us to the point of inner crisis, which, once passed through surrender, brings on an ecstasy of ultimate transcendence, opening us up and orienting us in such a way that we are most likely to receive and recognize grace. This grace can be described as a mystical experience and often results in powerfully positive transformative effects, and it is usually accompanied by insights and epiphanies, a turning around of the mind. This is our final arcanum of prayer. Prayer is the alpha and omega of spiritual practice and experience. Invoke often, inflame thyself with prayer. Well, that was a lot. And you may be asking now, well, how do I choose a prayer to use, or how do I write my own? So now that I've provided you with all of the keys or the arcana of prayer, of which I am at least aware at this point, I'm almost certain there are others I'm missing, I want to cover exactly that, how to choose a prayer. what words to recite, what invocations to make use of, and how you can make sense of all of this. So, in my book, Foundations, I cover how to write your own prayer based on the formula I used to write my prophet's prayer, which we covered earlier. You can feel free to make use of that prayer if you like. If it feels right to you, that's awesome. If not, you can always write your own if you feel up to it. Otherwise, you can make use of other prayers, poetry, or even Bible verses, specifically the Psalms. As long as it has the right orientation of reverence and adoration and helps you build emotional energy. Israel Regardie provides us with many beautiful and inspired examples of invocations in his many books. So I am going to leave you with one which he recommends for evening prayer after one has completed the preliminary relaxation techniques. Check out my video if you want to know one such technique. Here's the prayer that Israel Regardie offers to us for us to use. From thy hand, O Lord, cometh all good. The characters of nature with thy fingers hast thou traced, but none can read them unless he has been taught in thy school. Therefore, even as servants look unto the hands of their masters, and handmaidens unto their mistresses, even so do our eyes look unto thee. For thou alone art our help. O Lord our God, who should not extol thee? All is from thee, all belongeth unto thee. Either thy love or thy anger, all must again re-enter. Nothing canst thou lose, for all must tend unto thy honor and majesty. Thou art Lord alone, and there is none beside thee. Thou doest what thou wilt with thy mighty arm, and none can escape from thee. Who should not praise thee then, O Lord of the universe, unto whom there is none like, whose dwelling is in heaven, in every virtuous and God-fearing heart? O God, thou vast one, thou art in all things. O nature, thou self from nothing, for what else can I call thee? In myself I am nothing, in thee I am self, and exist in thy selfhood from eternity. Live thou in me, and bring me unto thyself which is in thee. Once again, that's from the 1-Year Manual. And with that, we've come to the end of this video on prayer. I hope it has expanded your view of prayer and possibly inspired you to pursue its practice more passionately. I know the rewards will be bountiful for you if you do. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video about prayer. I hope you learned a few things about how to be more effective, what to pray for, how to do it, got some examples of prayers you can use, etc. If you learned anything, if there was something specific that stood out to you, or if you have any questions, please leave me a comment below and let me know. I always answer and read any and all comments, and I really appreciate that. If you liked the video and you are not yet subscribed to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button as well. That really helps me out for the channel to grow and for my videos to reach a wider audience. You know, I really just want to promote open-mindedness and share the spiritual practices that I've learned that have benefited me and my friends and family. I think that anyone can benefit from learning about these things and implementing them in their lives. And I want this to be, you know, freely available to anyone who wants to pick up the practices or learn about these topics. So I want to continue to provide this for free to people on YouTube. And it really helps out, you know, if you at least just subscribe and like the videos. If you want to support me more than that, that's awesome. I'm very grateful to everyone who does. I do have a Patreon if you want to sign up for that and support me that way. Or I have also published a few books on spiritual practices, and you can purchase those, Foundations and Luna. There will be links in the description below. You can also just find me on Amazon as well if you want to buy them that way. All right, well, thank you for watching. I'll see y'all next week.